The first time I saw the girl from Kepri Station, she was bleeding starlight. That's the only way I can describe it. Not blood, at least not anything red or human, but a pale, shimmering fluid that caught the emergency lights and broke into 1,000 colors, like oil floating on water. She lay crumpled against the bulkhead of Dock 7, one arm twisted at an angle that made my stomach tighten, her breathing shallow and irregular. Around her, the station's alarms wailed in overlapping tones, and the smell of scorched metal still hung in the air from whatever explosion had torn through the outer ring. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was a freelance salvage runner, which is a polite way of saying I made a living picking over other people's disasters. My ship, the Wayfarer, had docked at Kepri to sell a crate of obsolete navigation cores, and I was halfway through a lukewarm cup of station coffee when the impact shook the entire habitat. The lights flickered, gravity stuttered, and then the alarm started screaming like the station itself was in pain. Most people ran the other way. I didn't. Not because I'm brave, because I'm stupidly curious, and because old habits die hard. I followed the smoke and the sparks until I reached Dock 7, where a small courier craft had been ripped open like a tin can. The hull breach had already been sealed by emergency fields, but whatever had been inside was scattered across the deck in twisted fragments. And there she was. She didn't look human, not exactly. She was roughly human-shaped, but taller, more slender, with skin the color of pale moonstone and faint, glowing lines tracing patterns along her arms and neck. Her hair, if you could call it that, was a cascade of fine, translucent strands that caught the light like glass fibers. One of her eyes was swollen shut, the other a deep, reflective violet that snapped open when I knelt beside her. She tried to speak. Whatever came out wasn't a word, just a thin, broken sound, like air leaking from a cracked seal. "Easy," I said, automatically, even though I had no idea if she understood me. "Don't move. You're hurt." Her gaze locked onto mine, sharp with something that looked a lot like fear, and something else, too. Calculation, maybe. Or desperation. I hit my calm. "Dock 7. We've got a survivor. Non-human. Looks bad. Send medical now." The station medics took 7 minutes to arrive. It felt like 70. During that time, I did the only thing I could. I stayed there. I pressed my jacket against the worst of the glowing wound in her side, tried to keep her still, tried not to think about how fragile she felt under my hands. She watched me the entire time, unblinking, as if she were memorizing my face. Just before the medics arrived, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers were long and cool, and the light in the patterns along her skin flared brighter. She said something in a language I didn't know. Then she passed out. Her name was Saris. At least, that's how the translator rendered it once she was stable enough to speak. She was from a species called the Ailiri, a name that meant nothing to me at the time but would come to mean far too much later. The medics told me she'd been lucky, if you could call it that. The explosion had thrown her clear of the worst of the wreckage, but shrapnel had torn through one of her internal organs. If I hadn't found her when I did, she would have bled out on the deck. They let me visit her in the recovery wing, mostly because she asked for me. She lay in a med pod that hummed softly, transparent panels showing her wrapped in bands of pale light that pulsed in time with her breathing. The glowing lines on her skin were dimmer now, but still visible, like embers under ash. When she saw me, her good eye focused, and a faint, careful smile touched her lips. "You stayed," she said, her words filtered through a small translator unit resting at her throat. The device gave her voice a soft, musical distortion. "I hoped you would." "Yeah, well," I said, suddenly aware of how awkward I felt. "You kind of grabbed me before you passed out. Figured I owed you a check-in." She tilted her head, studying me.
You do not owe me. I owe you.
My life, by your standards. I shrugged. Don't keep score. It was just right place, right time. She was quiet for a moment, then said, On my world, debts of life are not considered just anything. Over the next few days, I learned more than I ever expected to about the Aeliri. They were travelers, diplomats, sometimes traders, known for their advanced biotech and their strict codes of honor. Saris, it turned out, wasn't just any traveler. She was an envoy, sent to negotiate access to a chain of systems that lay dangerously close to disputed territory. The courier ship she'd been on had been sabotaged. Not an accident. An attempt on her life. Do you know who did it? I asked one evening, sitting beside her med pod while the station lights dimmed for artificial night. I have suspicions, she said carefully. But suspicion is not proof. And proof is difficult when one is alone. You're not alone, I said without thinking. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in her expression softened. That is why I asked to see you. I laughed a little nervously. If you're about to ask me to play bodyguard, you've got the wrong guy. I fly a patched-together salvage ship, not a war cruiser. I am not asking for protection, she said. Not in the way you mean. 2 days later, she was cleared to leave the med wing. The station authorities wanted her transferred to a more secure facility, but she refused. She insisted on staying aboard her own ship, what was left of it, anyway, or finding alternative transport. That's when she came to see me on the Wayfarer. My ship isn't pretty. It's functional, and that's about the nicest thing you can say. Sarah stepped inside and looked around with polite curiosity, her fingers brushing the edge of a console like she was reading its history through touch. You live here, she said. Most of the time, I replied. It's home, in a loose, occasionally tries to kill me kind of way. She smiled at that. Then she turned serious. I have a proposal for you. Those words should have been my warning. She explained it slowly, choosing her phrasing with care. The Aeliri, she said, did not leave life debts unpaid. When one person saved another from death, the debt could only be settled in 2 ways, by an act of equal value or by a binding partnership, formalized under Aeliri law. Partnership, I echoed. Like business partners? In your terms, she said, closer to allies bound by contract. Or spouses, in some of your cultures. I nearly choked. You're proposing marriage? We met in a hallway full of smoke 3 days ago. She didn't look offended, just thoughtful. I am proposing survival and trust. Her situation, it turned out, was worse than she'd let on. Whoever had sabotaged her ship wasn't finished. The political stakes around her mission were high enough that if she returned alone, she'd likely be killed before she could even reach Aeliri space. But if she returned with a bonded partner, especially a human, from a neutral and unpredictable species, it would complicate any attempt on her life. Under Aeliri law, harming a bonded partner was an act of war. You want to use me as a shield, I said. She met my eyes. I want to give you my name, my protection, and my resources. And yes, your presence would make it harder for my enemies to act openly. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. And the life debt? Would be considered repaid, she said softly, and transformed into something else. Something shared. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as alien nonsense. Another part, the part that had seen the fear in her eyes on Dock 7, knew she wasn't joking. What's the catch? I asked. The catch, she said, is that once bound, we cannot simply walk away. The contract lasts until one of us dies, or until it is formally dissolved by both parties, in person, before my people's council. That's a hell of a commitment. Yes, she agreed. It is. I told her I needed time. She gave it to me 3 hours. That's how long it took for someone to try to kill her again. They came for her in the station's lower transit ring, where the cameras were old and the crowds were thick. I wasn't with her. I was halfway back to my ship when the first explosion went off. By the time I reached the ring, security was already flooding the area, and Saris was gone. Not dead.
Taken.
I didn't think. I just ran. I found her tracker signal, a small, discreet beacon she'd hidden in her translator unit, leading into the maintenance levels. The corridors down there were narrow and dim, full of old cables and hissing pipes. I followed the signal until I heard voices ahead. Human voices, tense and angry. They had her pinned against a bulkhead, hands bound with some kind of energy restraint that made the light in her skin flicker weakly. There were 3 of them, armed, wearing no insignia. Payment doubles if we deliver her alive, one of them was saying. But I don't care. Dead is easier. I don't remember deciding to act. I just did. The first shot took one of them in the shoulder. He went down screaming. The second turned, firing wildly, and hit a pipe that burst into steam. The third lunged for Saris, and I tackled him, slamming him into the wall hard enough that his weapon clattered away. It was messy.
Loud.
Terrifying. When it was over, 2 of them were unconscious. One was bleeding and swearing, and Saris was staring at me like I'd just rewritten her understanding of the universe. Security arrived seconds later. After that, there wasn't really a decision left to make. We left Capri Station that night in the Wayfarer, with half my cargo still unsold and a very angry station master yelling at my comm channel. Sarah sat in the co-pilot seat, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the stars. "They will keep coming," she said quietly. "You know this now." "Yeah," I said. "I do." She turned to me. "And you still have not answered my proposal." I thought about the life I had, drifting from job to job, avoiding anything that looked like roots, telling myself that freedom was the same as happiness. I thought about Doc 7 and the way she'd looked at me when she was bleeding starlight onto the floor. "Okay," I said. "Let's hear the fine print." The bonding wasn't romantic in the way human stories make it sound. There was no ceremony with flowers and music. There was a quiet room on a neutral outpost, a circle of A'Leary witnesses projected in hologram, and a shared contract encoded into both our biometrics. It felt more like signing a treaty than getting married. But when it was done, I felt it, a subtle shift, like a new gravity in my chest, pulling me toward her. Saris felt it too. She looked at me, a little startled, then smiled. "Now," she said, "you are under my people's protection, and I am under yours." The journey to A'Leary space took weeks. We were chased twice, ambushed once, and very nearly boarded in a narrow transit corridor where the stars looked like frozen needles. Each time, we got through it together, me flying the ship like it was an extension of my own nervous system, Saris using her knowledge of political codes and enemy tactics to stay one step ahead. Somewhere along the way, the partnership stopped feeling like a contract and started feeling like something else. We talked about her world, with its living cities and glowing seas. About mine, with its stubborn little blue planet and its endless arguments about everything. We argued about music, about food, about whether my coffee counted as a crime against biology. We laughed more than I expected. One night, drifting between systems, she said, "On my world, this kind of bond often grows into affection." "And if it doesn't?" I asked. "Then it remains respect," she said. "That is also enough." When we finally reached A'Leary space, the political storm hit exactly as she'd predicted. There were accusations, investigations, thinly veiled threats. But no one touched us. No one dared. The contract worked. Weeks turned into months. The crisis eased. The enemies retreated, for now. And one evening, standing on a balcony overlooking a city that glowed like a constellation turned inside out, Sarah said, "Your debt has been repaid many times over." I looked at her. "So, what happens now?" She considered me for a long moment, then said, "Now, we decide whether this was only survival or the beginning of something we choose." I thought about the Wayfarer, about Capri Station, about the girl bleeding starlight who had grabbed my wrist in a hallway full of smoke. I said, "I'm okay not going back to the way things were." She smiled, and this time it wasn't careful at all. And for the first time in my drifting, salvage-running life, I realized I wasn't just flying away from things. The council chamber of the Aeleri wasn't built like anything human. It wasn't a room so much as a living space grown from crystal and light, with arching structures that seemed to breathe, slowly shifting color as if reacting to the emotions inside. I stood at Sarah's side, painfully aware that I was the only human in a place that had probably never expected to host one. The accusations came anyway. They were polite. Aeleri always were. But politeness doesn't make a knife less sharp. They questioned her judgment. They questioned her mission. And, inevitably, they questioned me. "A salvage runner," one counselor said, its voice echoing with layered harmonics. "An outsider. A liability." Saris didn't raise her voice when she answered. "He is my bonded partner under a law. If he is a liability, then so am I. And if you judge him unworthy, you judge my life unworthy of the debt he paid." Silence followed that. Heavy, thoughtful silence. The evidence of the sabotage was presented. The financial trails. The intercepted transmissions. Slowly, the shape of the conspiracy became clear. It hadn't been a random attack. It had been an attempt by a rival faction to destabilize negotiations before they even began. And it had failed. Not because of fleets or weapons. Because one stubborn human had refused to walk past a dying girl on a station floor. The council ruled in Saris's favor. The conspirators were named. Sanctions were announced. Protection was formally granted, not just to her, but to both of us. When we left the chamber, Saris's shoulders finally relaxed, just a little. "It is done," she said quietly. "Feels like it's just starting," I replied. She looked at me with that familiar, thoughtful expression. "Yes. That is what frightens me, and what gives me hope." In the weeks that followed, life became strangely calm. Too calm, almost after everything we'd been through. The Wayfarer was granted clearance to remain in Aeleri space. Saris was reinstated as envoy, this time with full authority and a small security detail that tried very hard not to look like they were guarding me. We didn't talk about the contract much anymore. We didn't need to. One evening, we stood on a high terrace overlooking the bioluminescent sea of her world. The water glowed in slow-moving currents of blue and gold, and the sky above was crowded with unfamiliar stars. "On my world," Saris said, "many bonded pairs separate once the crisis that joined them has passed. The law allows it. The debt is considered settled." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Is that what you want?" She turned to face me. The patterns in her skin were bright in the twilight, not from stress this time, but from something warmer. I wanted survival. I wanted security. I wanted my people to be safe. And I thought that was all I wanted. She paused, then added more softly, "I was wrong. I didn't trust my voice, so I just waited. You chose to risk your life for me more than once," she continued. "Not because of law. Not because of debt. Because you chose to. That is rare, where I come from. And precious." I looked out at the glowing sea, then back at her. Where I come from, we're pretty bad at formal vows. But we're good at sticking around when it matters. Her smile was slow and real and a little shy. Then perhaps we are not so different. Months later, when the Wayfarer finally lifted off again, it wasn't to run from anything. We weren't fleeing danger or chasing quick money. We were traveling together. Part envoy mission, part exploration, part something neither of us had a good name for yet. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we sat in silence, watching stars slide past and feeling the quiet, steady comfort of not being alone in the void. The contract still existed, written into both our biometrics, recognized by both our worlds. But it wasn't the reason we stayed. One night, long after we'd left Aerie space behind us, I asked, "Do you ever regret making that proposal?" Saris considered the question, then reached out and took my hand, her fingers cool, familiar, and steady.
"No," she said.
Because I did not only save my life that day. She looked at me, eyes reflecting starlight. I found a future I would not have chosen and now cannot imagine losing. And as the Wayfarer carried us forward into a sky full of unknown worlds, I realized something simple and terrifying and wonderful all at once. I hadn't just saved an alien girl's life on Capri Station. Somewhere along the way, she'd given me one back.